Hello, good morning, everybody. So, this article is among many articles, and I wanted to start with this article because it says the housing market racism persists despite fair housing laws. And you see who the name is underneath it's Kianga Yamata Taylor. And so I'm going to read this article, but I wanted to switch over first and show you something that's happening more recent. Um, So I don't know if anybody has witnessed this. This is Cincinnati, and so I recently did a video about how the housing market is still discriminating Black people. It discriminates Black people in Los Angeles, I believe. Still, there's still segregation. It's just not, talked about. People live a segregated life. They choose to live in neighborhoods where they're around people who look more like them, or a neighborhood who caters to more their culture. And some of that, it seems harmless, but what's bad about it, it alienates people from other cultures. And it's pretty much going back into the same system of segregation because we've been used to living like that. And so Cincinnati police is sued after a realtor and his client were handcuffed while inspecting a home. And so this recently happened. And so the Cincinnati Enquirer has an article, Fox 19 has an article, and City Beat has an article about it. And so I'm going to quickly show you the City Beat article about Cincinnati police sued after the realtor and the client were handcuffed while inspecting the home for a sale. So I have personally said that I suspect that the same prevalence of redlining and racism and hatred for Black home buyers still persist in the US. And it's true, it does. It's so persistent and so prevalent that even Black realtors feel the brunt of it. And so this is pretty much what one of many, and I'm sure there's others, incidences where people have had altercations with law enforcement or with neighbors who don't want them to move in certain neighborhoods because of their skin color, or they assume that they're breaking in the home because they don't see Black people owning a home or buying a home. They see you as a criminal. And so, according to the lawsuit, officers handcuffed two men during a scheduled visit to the West Prince Hill house that was up for sale. And so, one of the men was licensed, he was a licensed realtor. So, this is by Rick Swartzel. And so, this is a recent situation that happened. It's not something that happened a couple of years ago. And so, a potential home buyer and his realtor filed a lawsuit in federal court yesterday. And this article came out on the 16th. So this was against the city of Cincinnati over an incident in which the two were allegedly handcuffed by Cincinnati police while legally inspecting a house. Okay, they had the license, they had the right to inspect the house, and it was up for sale. So according to the lawsuit that was filed by the attorney Chris Finney, Anthony Edwards and his realtor, Jerry Isham. Now, excuse me if I did not pronounce the last name correctly, but I believe it's uh, sort of in a biblical sense. So it has a pronunciation. So this realtor and his client, they were arrested and they had a scheduled visit to view a house. It was at 1093 Morado Drive in West Prince Hill last November of 17 and gain entry via a key left in a lockbox at the front door. So as they entered, a neighbor and a former police officer named Thomas Bryan called Cincinnati police to report them breaking and entering. So this is basically what I said before I even read into the article. So I just seen two Black males, subjects forced the door open. Brannigan, who is white, told the police, according to the lawsuit. So Brannigan also indicated that the house was for sale and that he did not see either men with a weapon, but that he himself did have a firearm. So three CPD officers, Dustin P., David Knox, and Rose Valentino, responded to the call. So Pete, Knox, and both they had arrived first, and Knox going around the left side of the house, and Pete waiting out in the front. So the lawsuit states this. So Valentino arrived shortly after and went around the right side of the house. So Pete saw Isham and Edwards through the front window of the house and commanded them to come out of the house. So as they compiled, the lawsuit states that Valentino unholstered her firearm and pointed it at the two. So they had a gun pointed. Now, this is a realtor showing a house to a client. They both happen to be black, and this is in Cincinnati. And because the neighbors and an off duty cop or whatever, they suspected they were, because they're black, and let's just be honest, that has a lot to do with it. Because they're black, that they must have been breaking into the home. They weren't a realtor and a client, and the realtor is showing the home to the client. No, these are two black males and they're forced their way in. They didn't have any weapons and they must be criminals, so they broke in. So we need to call Cincinnati PD. So that's basically what this was. And so now there's a lawsuit being filed with the courts because of this incident, because these people were not breaking and entering. One of them was a realtor, he had a license, and the other was a client, and he was being shown the home so that he could be a possible home buyer. So the lawsuit includes that the body camera still appears to show Valentino pointing the weapon, either a firearm or a taser. Okay. So Edwards told the officers that he was there to see the house and that Isham is the real estate agent. Valentino put Isham in handcuffs until he can confirm that story, according to the suit. So he did not believe that he was a realtor. He had to confirm that he was a real licensed realtor before he could unhandcuff him. So tell me if I'm wrong, but racism still is prevalent. There's a prevalence in the US in the home market arena. So if you can't even be a realtor and show a home in a neighborhood without getting arrested or having the neighbors call the cops on you, then what do you think is going to happen in other major cities when the same things happen or when black people are trying to buy homes? They're going to be discriminated. So the article that this kind of coincides with the article that I was reading yesterday, that, they were saying that one group is able to achieve something versus another group. Namely, they're pretty much making comparisons uh, from African American versus Hispanic families. And when you come to Los Angeles, if you look in Los Angeles, you'll see both cultures living in the same neighborhood side by side and both having some of the same struggles. And so whoever wrote that article is not being honest. They're not being truthful and factual. And more than likely, they don't live in these neighborhoods. So they're not being honest. This, however, is telling you a picture of something totally the opposite of what their article was, talking about that one group is doing better than another and making it seem that African Americans don't try, they don't work hard, they're not able to buy homes, they don't make money, they're not educated. Well, here you have a realtor. And don't you have to get licensed and you have to go to school to do that? And you have to have some type of knowledge in the arena of housing market and business. And I'm sure he has a degree in that. I'm sure he has to go to get a certificate in order for him to get licensed. So he's educated. And the other person who's buying the home, he's black. So he has to have money to be looking at a home, or he has to have some kind of gumption to know that, I'm going to accumulate wealth if I buy a home, so I need to do this for my family. So no, he's not looking to be on welfare. He's not looking to be on public assistance. He's looking to try to better his family. But in these other articles that you're hearing out about, they make it look like African Americans don't try, we don't work, we don't have any education, and we're not trying to do anything better with our lives when we've been trying to do better stuff with our lives for how many years? More than 400, 500 years. There's talks of reparations right now, but you don't see anybody saying anything in the articles about that except people who are concerned with the Black community, like to Nisi Coates, the journalist who brought up that debate in court about examining the issues around surrounding reparations, and this goes right in line with it. If we have people that are still locking Black people and realtors up because they're showing a home, and you have Black people trying to own a home, and you can't even do that without getting accosted or arrested. Yes, U.S. still has a prevalence of racism in terms of how they treat Black people in the home buying market. So the suit claims that Valentino searched Isham's pockets unlawfully and found that the real estate business cards were in there. And despite that, both Isham and Edwards continued to be detained. Even though he found the business cards of the realtor, he still held the realtor in a cell like a common criminal. So despite that, both Isham and Edwards continued to be detained, and none of the officers indicated why the two were being held beyond needing to confirm that Isham was a real estate agent. Meanwhile, according to the suit, Brennigan, the neighbor who called the police, which we've had a lot of that happening all over the US, where people call the police on regular Black people doing regular everyday stuff, and you get arrested or you get apprehended or you could nearly get shot by the cops because they assume that you must be a criminal because you're Black. So yes, it's still prevalent. So meanwhile, according to the suit, Brennigan, the neighbor who called the police, was allowed by the officers to hover around the scene. Okay. And so he was allowed to hover around the scene, but none of the officers involved undertook any action to secure the scene at 1090 Morado Drive by having the uh, complainant and his firearm immediately removed from the vicinity so as to promote and ensure officer safety, the suit reads. So eventually, more officers arrived to the scene. At least 9 officers arrived at the scene in total, according to the lawsuit. So 9 officers to see the matter of a realtor and his client, which whom they happen to be Black, because a neighbor called the police on them and assumed that they must have been breaking into the home. They're criminals. So you see what I'm getting at. So at that point, the filing alleges that Knox and another officer went to inspect the home's front door, where they found that the lockbox had no damage to the property. They didn't see any damage. So they found the lockbox. So notwithstanding the confirmation of the presence and the use of the lockbox, Isham and Edwards continued to be handcuffed. So they kept them in handcuffs with their freedom and liberty restrained. And so the suit reads this. So it was not until the complete search of the residence and further consultation with the sergeant of Cincinnati PD on the scene, Sergeant Titus Fillmore, did the officer Knox finally direct the handcuffs to be removed off Isham and Edwards. So the suit also alleges that the body camera footage of the portions of the incident was deleted. They didn't want you to see that because then you'll see how these two were also treated physically. We're just reading this. We didn't want to see the physical treatment of how they treated this Black realtor and this Black prospective homeowner because they know that would really get people upset. I'm almost certain that they were not only just casually handcuffed, It was not done like that. It was forcibly handcuffed. And so we're not seeing that. So on April 18, 2019, the city of Cincinnati, through the office of the city solicitor, acknowledged that while certain responsive video recordings were provided, certain responsive video recordings were not provided in response to the public record request. And in fact, a total of 7 responsive videos had been destroyed by the lawsuit state. So think about that. So the action of the officers constituted a violation of Isham and Edwards' civil rights and a false arrest. And the lack of the body camera footage for the entire incident represented unlawful destruction of records, and the suit charges this. So the plaintiffs are seeking damage according fees and costs, as well as an injunction preventing the city and the police department from illegal removal, destruction, mutilation, or transfer of or other damage to the disposition of police body camera videos or police cruiser videos. So the city of Cincinnati, Knox, Valentino, and Edwards are all named as defendants in the lawsuit. So Brennigan, the neighbor, is not. So a police record of the 911 call Brennigan made obtained through the records request confirms a general outline of the suit's narrative about the incident. So the complainant on the scene and spoken to the record reads, complainant was sure forced entry was made. Okay, so this is Brennigan, he's the complainant. So however, investigations that revealed the 2 individuals located inside legally used a lockbox key, and as one was the realtor and one is the client. So the house was checked and no other unreported damage located. So immediately upon discovering this, Sergeant Fillmore met the officers, agreed that the breaking and entering report was unfounded and it was inaccurately reported, and both individuals were taken out of the handcuffs. And so the complainant admitted on Sergeant Fillmore's body-worn camera that he did not have a good view of the entry and may have been mistaken, and the report continues this. So a spokesperson for the city of Cincinnati said that today that the city does not comment on pending litigation. So City Beat has requested body camera and cruiser dash cam footage of the incident. So the story will be updated. So that's the developing story right there on this particular incident that just happened. Very, very recent. Okay, you see the date here. And so when I go over here, I believe, I don't know if there's any video, but it looked like there was a lawsuit. It said the same thing, the realtor home buyer viewing house illegally held by police after a 911 call. And so there's a video here and it's accompanied by it. But I want to switch over and basically get into this article that's talking about housing market racism persists despite fair housing laws. And so the name of this person is Keanaga Yamada Taylor. So in the U.S., getting into this article, in the U.S. where home ownership speaks to class. Okay, African Americans are being denied mortgages at rates much higher than their white peers. So the other article I was reading yesterday had to do with making comparisons as to why one group is able to flourish or do a little bit better, have a little more opportunity in the home buying game versus African Americans. Well, here's your answer. In the US, where home ownership speaks to class, African Americans are being denied mortgages at rates much higher than their white peers. Okay, and so this article is not, it's not from a long time ago either. So as a new year begins and the 2020 presidential election looms closer, our political focus will start to narrow around the issues thought to be most urgent and likely to mobilize voters. Okay, so one issue surely to be glossed over is not completely ignored. It is persistent of racial segregation. That's still happening in the US right now. It is happening, and it's happening in the housing market. So even writing it feels off topic, like referring to an anachronism. Okay, so we have become habited or habituated to and ingrained treads of our racial geography. Okay, that they are unremarkable. So the segregation is remarked upon and is almost always in reference to the histories of the public policy and the private action that were necessary to the invention of the black neighborhoods, quote unquote, or white suburbs. So even though laws are supposed to be eradicated, redlining, there's supposed to be new opportunities for people, that doesn't mean people are going to act on those accordingly. It's just like when they said the slaves are free. Okay, you're free, but that doesn't shield you from racism. That doesn't shield you from prejudice. It doesn't shield you from discrimination, and it doesn't shield you from harsh treatment of people who do not want to live around blacks, or they don't favor or don't like, or they have a deep hatred towards people who are black. So they will do other things, discriminate you on jobs, discriminate you in the housing market, which is still happening today. The job market, the same thing. And so these things are prevalent still in the US. It's just not talked about as widely, and it's hidden. People are careful with their words. They're careful not to say certain things in jargon. They're careful to use code words now. Like they say the black, quote unquote, black neighborhoods, quote unquote, white suburbs. So, in other words, residential segregation and discrimination in America housing market are considered historical matters. But that the nefarious operation of the Federal Housing Administration have come to light and redlining has become more widely understood, have not been enough to generate the urgency necessary of dismantling today's unjust housing practices. So consider the muted recognition of the 50th anniversary of 1968 Fair Housing Act. In its time, federal fair housing, which entailed the right to be free of racial discrimination in the housing market. So it was hailed as the crowning achievement of the rights revolution of the 1960s. But the effects of fair housing have been imperceptible in large swaths of the country where poor and working class African Americans live in racially segregated enclaves. So the reluctant celebrations of fair housing, okay, acts, milestones, anniversary this past year were rooted in the basic fact that racism continues to pervade the American housing markets. And so let me say that again. In its federal fair housing, which entailed the right to be free of racial discrimination in the housing market, was hailed as the crowning achievement of the rights revolution of the 1960s. But the effects of the fair housing have been imperceptible in large swaths of the country where poor and working class African Americans live racially segregated enclaves. So the reluctant celebrations of the Fair Housing Act's milestone anniversary this past year were rooted in the basic fact that racism continues to pervade the American housing markets. So the reality was made worse by the selection of the underwhelming neurosurgeon Ben Carson. And if you don't know who he is, look up all of the issues surrounding the housing and fair housing, and you will find that he used to be a neurosurgeon, but Donald Trump appointed him, Ben Carson, as the Secretary of Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if you look at Department of Housing and Urban Development, you will find him. So Carson has characterized the formal objectives of the Fair Housing Act, including affirmative pursuit of racially and ethnically mixed communities as social engineering. So this is a black man who basically he's in this housing development, he's appointed as a secretary, but he is far removed from the issues that go on, even though he's black himself. So if you look at some of his ideologies and the things that he promotes as policy that he agrees upon, it's totally the opposite. It's almost like, let me put it in layman's terms, having a black man, and even though he's black on the outside, you see he's a black man, and he might have come from neighborhoods like where people are poor or working class, but he's far removed from the issues. It's almost as if on the inside he is, you know, a segregationist himself, or somebody that is a supremacist, like a underneath his skin. So he pretty much distanced himself from the social issues that African Americans go through day to day, even though yet he is African American himself. And so Carson has characterized formal objectives of fair housing, including the affirmative pursuit of racially and ethnically mixed communities, as social engineering. So he's worked to undo the legally mandated responsibility of HUD to not only fight racial discrimination, but to pursue integrated communities where it can. So he claims he's fighting discrimination, but he does more to actually promote, to do harmful effects towards it. He claims he's just helping, but I don't see where he's helping. So the effects of fair housing have been imperceptible in large swaths of the country. But even before the neurosurgeon took the sledgehammer to the state mission of HUD, the agency was hardly effective in rooting out discrimination, of course. So if there were any questions, they had to have been snuffed out by the housing collapse that precipitated the economy. This was during 2008 when everybody started losing homes, and there was more problems of foreclosure, the anniversary of which was the scarcely what it was also scarcely observed. So when the dust settled, more than 240,000 African Americans had lost homes to foreclosure because of predatory home loans. That is the reason why a lot of Black people do not get excited about owning a home as much as they used to, because there were predatory lenders. And then a lot of times, even when they were dealing with lenders, they would be um, given high rates on home loans, and even with good credit, they are still given higher rates. And so that is the reason why you have that. So this gives you an eye opener as to why there's still discrimination, still things that are persistent and prevalent in the US. So the story of the real estate racism in the subprime loan market is an old one. That's what they claim, but it served as a reminder that no matter the language of the law regarding fair housing, racism in the market still persisted, and it's still persistent. Even though we're not in 2008, we're in 2019, going on 2020, still there is racism in the housing market. And I just read a story, that's but one of many. So the destruction of the value of Black housing 10 years ago has set a stage to revamp exploitive practices that view African American communities as sites of extraction instead of investment. So let me stop there. If you have a neighborhood that's looked at, like they said, extraction, where you want to like not put money in those communities, not invest in those communities, or you let them houses get dilapidated because of the fact that you have a large portion of this group is Black and a large portion of this group is Hispanic or Latino, and they look closer to white, or they're claiming Caucasian, then you're going to have a problem. You're still doing segregation. You're still doing the practices of it's not fair housing. You're still doing the practices of redlining. Even though you're not making that red pen and drawing the line, but people mentally know, okay, South LA, that's Black people, or that's poor Latinos, poor Blacks. In their mind, they got that in their mind. South Central, what do we hear? South Central, they give it a name. Oh, that's the poor neighborhood. Oh, that's the hood. So people mentally have segregated themselves. So the destruction of the value of Black housing 10 years ago has set a stage to revamp exploitive practices that view African American communities as sites of extraction instead of investment. So in cities that suffered, namely these cities you're going to hear about, which is still going on, some of the greatest housing losses, Chicago and Detroit. There has been a resurgence of land installment contracts, sales on homes for those whose credit won't allow them to secure conventional loans, disproportionately elevated rates of poverty, few financially meaningful assets, and rock bottom wealth accumulation have combined with racist assumptions in this contemporary moment to once again marginalize prospective Black property owners. That is what is happening. Okay, so of course, across the country, African Americans are being denied mortgages at rates dramatically higher than their white peers. So in Philadelphia, for instance, African Americans are almost 3 times more likely to be rejected for home loans than white people are. As a result, the gap between Black homeownership is 44% and white homeownership is 69%, which is very enormous. So that's alarming. So that should tell you, that should throw up a red flag that racism is still prevalent in the housing market. So the much discussed wealth disparities between African American and white families is deeply rooted in Black marginalization within the housing market. So in the US, where homeownership makes all the difference in terms of social and class mobility, African Americans' fraud access to this asset has put Black families at a permanent disadvantage. And so the rising cost of rent weigh heaviest in African Americans who suffer from lower wages. Why do we get lower wages? Some may not be working jobs that pay 6 figures or pay, 40, $48 an hour. And then why are you in positions where you don't make that much money? Because you're not given a fair chance to get in higher positions so you can make more money so that you can buy homes, so that you can get homes in a community where people are not discriminating you from getting homes. And then if you get a home, you want not be you have your realtor locked up and you locked up because you happen to be Black people. So anyway, going on, it says over the last year, rents have risen across the U.S. to about 4% on average. So, of $1,209 for a one-bedroom apartment and $1,442 for a two-bedroom apartment. Okay, in some cities like San Francisco, Boston, New York, and Chicago, it's nearly impossible to find a safe and sound apartment for these prices. So the cost of rent climbs above income. Ordinary people face eviction, displacement, and homelessness. And that is what we're dealing with right now in the US. These are real facts. This is what is happening. And that is the reason why you have some people that are Black that don't feel like their money is going very far, or they're being mistreated on jobs, they're being mistreated in the housing market as well, and they're being priced out of neighborhoods so that they can move further away or either end up moving somewhere where there's no real jobs, or you have to drive miles to get to work in the morning, which makes it harder for you to be successful on your job. And on top of that, you're going to spend a lot of money to travel to get to work. And then you're going to live in neighborhoods. Maybe you have a place to stay. It might be cheaper to live, but they're still going to raise your rents because it's happening everywhere now. And so escalating rents can also help to constitute markets out of condemned and otherwise uninhabitable properties. So the Philadelphia in Philadelphia's hundreds of apartments have been legally designated as unfit for human habitation, and yet landlords often illegally collect tens of thousands of dollars in rent on these dwellings. And so, even though the place is, a mess hole, the landlords still want the rent. They don't fix anything. They don't replace your appliances. They don't try to upkeep the building and do maintenance on it. They don't care about security. They don't care if people kill each other in there. They just want the rent. That's basically what it is. So according to a Harvard study between 2010 and 2017, prices in the poor urban neighborhoods rose at 50%. Okay. The poor neighborhoods, the prices of renting and home owning and whatever you're going to do there, that prices rose 50% faster than the rich neighborhoods. Okay. So cities will often turn a blind eye in the case of the most egregious housing abuses because they are not willing to create an alternative. So over the last 2 decades, tens of thousands of units of the public housing have been destroyed, often on the lie that they would be replaced. And they're not. They're replaced, all right, but with high-rise condos and high-rise rent. So I'm adding that in there because that's what I see in LA, and I'm sure it's happening in other cities, and I have seen that in other cities. So, but rather than replacing just desperately needed public housing or developing concrete plans for refurbishing affordable housing, which we are now having those talks, municipalities allow dangerous and last resort housing to exist for its poorest and often Black residents. So, in place of publicly financed and managed housing, housing vouchers ostensibly allow holders to overcome the expense of rentals in better resourced neighborhoods have been put forward. Okay, so that's the reason why some Blacks will end up having to be on Section 8. For those commenters that say that Blacks gravitate to Section 8, that's not true. You're forced when you have no other options and you have a family to feed and you want a roof over your head, you don't want to live and pitch in a tent out on the street, you're forced to make a hard decision. Do you want to try to wait years and years, discrimination on your job, and then your money is not right to try to get in something that probably is overpriced and you're not going to be able to afford it and you're going to end up homeless? Or do you take this voucher because it's going to help you pay your rent and see a clean roof over your head or some safe enough or half decent dwelling for your family so that you can carry on with your life? Which decision are you going to make? Whether you're white, black, green, or blue, you're going to make the decision to take the voucher. So, for those of you people out there that think that people are happy about that, they're not. If they had another way, they would. And there have been people that have tried, but look what has happened to them thus far. So, in the place of publicly financed and managed housing vouchers that ostensibly allow holders to overcome the expense of rentals in better resource neighborhoods have been put forward. But renters wait for an average of 32 months to obtain vouchers. So, the wait even for that is long. So, it isn't a quick fix, and it isn't something that you're going to get right away because there's a long list of homeless people or people who are almost darn near homeless if they're not pitching a tent now in Skid Row waiting for these vouchers. And it happens not only in LA, it happens in Chicago, it happens in Washington, D.C., and New York. So, and with the exception of those living in Chicago and New York and D.C., no landlord is required to accept them. So you got a voucher. You're on Section 8. But your landlord could say, we don't take that. What do? Some landlords take it while others can reject it. Now, moving along, for those who are trying to make it look like people are not trying and they're not working hard enough, you have all these obstacles in front of you. So, and with the exception of those living, like I said, in Chicago, no landlords, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., they don't have to take those vouchers. So in a city like New Orleans, 99% of the voucher recipients are African American, and 82% of the landlords refuse to accept those vouchers. And they know why. Because they know 99% of the people that are over there, they're poor, they're discriminated, and they're alienated, and they're pushed in one community. And so they don't want to accept those vouchers. So you got to find another way. So even in cities where this practice is supposed to be illegal without a commitment and staffing and enforced anti-discrimination laws, there's very little to stop housing discrimination. That's still prevalent in the US. So the result is poor and working class Neighborhoods with black renters remain isolated in economically marginalized neighborhoods. So these are communities that have become ripe for human dispossibility. Okay, so these are the food and job deserts where families are stranded by inadequate public transit systems and rising fuel costs. The disinvestment from neighborhoods shows up in under-resourced public services and facilities like schools, hospitals, libraries are all hemmed in by the violent and abusive policies. So while we may understand many of the roots of the residential discrimination is persistent, has created the perception that it is an unchanging and even a permanent fact of American life. So the visual marketers of the multiracial society and the fact that the racial boundaries that used to be virtually airtight have become somewhat more permeable, have perhaps mitigated the sense of urgency that residential segregation inspired 50 years ago. But the crises spawned by the spatial, economic, and social isolation of African Americans throughout the 20th century are still generating consequences, even today, even if we don't discuss them as such. And it isn't widely discussed. So, housing is central to the good life of the US. And at the same time, America's governing bodies have abdicated a responsibility to house the residents to a private and profit seeking sector that has played a historic role in segregation in our cities and suburbs today. It has happened and it's still happening as we speak, as I'm speaking. So the real estate industry has always relied on racism to generate profit for its stewards. So it is quite simply why racism continues to flourish in the housing market a half century after the Fair Housing Act has been passed. So until we remove profitability from the equation and instead treat um, to safe the right to safe and sound housing as a human and civil right, residential segregation will continue to thrive and in turn drive up the prices. So the higher the cost of housing, the more those who will suffer from lower wages, higher debt, are forced to the margins of the market. African Americans are overrepresented in the group of people suffering from the inequality, demonstrating yet again how race is firmly linked to the class of the US. Okay, so basically, that's the article. All right, and it pretty much tells you what's really happening in the housing market, that it is a long systemic racism that has not gone away. Just because you hear, oh, there's no more redlining and you can virtually live anywhere you want to, that's not true. That's not true. If you have the money and you can afford to live wherever you want to live, you might can do it, but that still doesn't shield you from racism and prejudice. People can still firebomb you out of a neighborhood if they don't want you there. They can still make ways to make it hard for you to live in that neighborhood, even if you have the money. And then if you are struggling on your job, if you're struggling to make ends meet, you're still going to be met with the same problems that happened from years ago. So, anyway, with that being said, I'm going to let this video go. Well, I thought it was important because I feel like they don't really put out the truth in a lot of things and they're not telling people what's going on. And people are supposed to assume that we're in this post racial society where no discrimination is happening whatsoever. And so that's easier for people to believe so they can write off the ideology of reparations for African Americans. And so this is one of the reasons why you see people talking about that issue, talking about how all that ties into it. The housing market racism is persistent still today, even despite fair housing laws. With that being said, I'm going to let this video go. Thanks for listening. If you want to look at the other article about the realtor and the lawsuit, the black realtor and the black home buyer, And the lawsuit, it is here. And you can just look it up by title. I don't know if it'll show because this is the Cincinnati article. And so there's several articles that are out that are dealing with that particular incident. And there may be some video footage of some of the incident as well, of maybe the police talking to some people. They might have released some of the dash cam footage and some of it that wasn't destroyed, but know that a lot of it was destroyed. But with that being said, I'm gonna leave this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for listening.